got an opportunity to meet for the first time last night, but was delighted, Sean Theriault. And there's a biography of him, as there is of all the speakers in your program, but I'll just say a few things that I've learned about Sean. He is one of the leading scholars about what makes Congress work and not work. And his book, The Gingrich Senators, examined how participant warfare emerged as a common practice in the Senate. He's co-director of the U.S. Policy Agenda Project, which studies the issues that Congress works on. And I'm told he has probably sent more students to work for Congress than anyone else. He teaches the J.J. Pickle research internship class and brings dozens of students to meet other former students working in D.C. One of his former students, Lance Goodwin, was elected to Congress in 2018, and the day after the election, he spoke to Sean's congressional elections class. And just last night, I learned that Sean also studies the politics of the Vatican, which I thought was really interesting. And if you read in his bio, it says that he's a really great teacher. The students really like him. And I think my impression was I can really see why that's true. He's one of those people. So very much, let's give a warm welcome to Sean. Thank you.
So thank you for that warm introduction. I'm a great dinner guest, right? I like to talk about politics, religion, and just those two things. I'm thrilled to be here today, so I want to thank our sponsors. I want to thank in particular a former student, E.J. Fagan, who is on the organizing committee, as well as Aleka, and the entire organizing committee for putting this event together. So I have a couple of apologies to make. So the first apology is, I don't know if you're aware, but I'm going to be talking about Congress today, not the most popular institution in the world. And the second apology is that I'm going to be presenting research that's only in the middle of being done. So I'm going to ask lots of questions. Hopefully I answer a couple of them. And I would just ask you, if you like some of this stuff, that maybe in 2 or 3 years when there's a book, you'll buy the book to hear what the final answer that I come up with is. So today I'm going to be talking about the social fabric in the U.S. Senate. It was awfully nice to hear from Congressman Lipinski last night. So it turned out that he and I applied for the same job at the University of Tennessee 23 years ago. And he didn't know that I interviewed against him. And so he doesn't know this next fact, that I was offered the job before he was. So I turned down the job that he then accepted, and that's where he started his professional career. Of course, he later went on to Congress, so he got the last laugh. But I'm going to be focusing a lot on the Senate today. And it was nice because he tipped his hat yesterday in thinking about some of the differences between the House and the Senate. And I think you'll see how that plays out in some of the research that I'm doing. But I'm going to first start a little broader. And so I'm just going to talk about some of the problems with Congress. So the first, and none of these are going to be surprising to you, Congress is unpopular. So if you ask the American public, do you approve or disapprove how Congress is doing its job? These are the latest figures from Real Clear Politics. Someone throw out a percentage. How many people approve of the way that Congress is doing its job? 15, 10. All right, a little bit better than that. Right now it's 20%. Although I'm right, this wasn't taking into consideration everything that happened last week with Speaker McCarthy, so we might be at 10. When we look at the historical trends, we see that Congress is about as popular now as it's been over much of the last 30 or 40 years. Another way that we can look at congressional unpopularity is in one of these word clouds, right? So an interviewer will say, what's the first word that comes to mind when I say the word Congress? And then the response, right? And so when they took all of that and they aggregated the words, the bigger the word, the more people said. So worthless, partisan, incompetent, dysfunctional, useless, and ineffective. So I could give you the rest of the morning to stare at that before you find something positive. I stared at it a little bit longer than I'll give you. I found 2 positive words. So one, let's start at the bottom, okay. I teach lots of undergraduates at the University of Texas, and if you've been around 20-year-olds, whenever you ask them any question, the first thing they'll say is, okay, how about, and the right person doing the survey is like, I heard okay, I'm writing down okay, and so I think that's how that ended up there. And then serving, my guess is that they didn't include the adjective before serving, which would be self. And so we'll just go with those two. Another way that you could measure congressional unpopularity is I'm going to give you 2 items. You tell me which one you like better. So do you like Congress or do you like head lice? The American public likes head lice, 67% to 19%. They like Brussels sprouts, 69% to 23%. They like the country of France, 46 to 37. I'm a little bit hesitant to show this next one, especially for those of you that live in Chicago. People like traffic jams more than they do Congress. If you're a little bit squeamish, you might want to avert your eyes. They like root canals more than they like Congress. Lest you think that anything is more popular than Congress, there are a few things that are less popular than Congress. Lobbyists are less popular than Congress. And the country of North Korea is a little bit less popular than Congress. So second congressional pathology is that it's unproductive, right? I don't have to show you any visuals for this, but we could very well see that sign in 41 days, right? I think we're at 41 days. What is happening is that they are legislating less and they're grandstanding more. So the dashed line is the number of hearings that congressional committees are having that have to deal with legislation. And then the dark bold line are the number of congressional hearings where they're just doing oversight, which tends to be more grandstanding, allowing them to yell at administration officials or Fauci or whoever you will. They're enacting less laws, and it doesn't matter if there's unified Congresses, Republican or Democrat, in red and blue, of course, and then divided Congress or divided government, in the ones in purple. They're enacting less appropriation bills on time, which means that you have to have more continuing resolutions, which increases the propensities for shutdowns. There's many more filibusters across time. And again, it doesn't matter if if the Senate and the president are of the same party, opposite parties. It's just increasing over time. The third congressional pathology is that Congress is polarized. So if we look at just the raw voting scores of member of Congress, Republicans are becoming increasingly to the right, Democrats a little bit more to the left in both the House and the Senate. A different way we could visualize that is if we think of every single member as being a dot, and then the closeness of the dots indicates how close they voted with each other. So this is back in the mid-1970s. You see lots of blue and red dots, and it looks like a big kind of cloud. That cloud increasingly is separated into a blue ball and a red ball. I've contributed to the study of this, so I wrote a book called Party Polarization in Congress, and I wrote that book in 2008, and I feel like every month there's another chapter that I could write. And so it's just getting worse. The fourth congressional pathology is that Congress is becoming less collegial. I don't think that, the Republicans kicked Pelosi out of her hideaway office right away. And you have, these are in a little bit messed up order, right? You have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's putting up a sign talking about males and females because her office is across the hallway from a different member who has a transgender child. Whether or not it's Kevin McCarthy and Matt Gaetz yelling at each other on the House floor. And then the picture that you can't see in back is perhaps my favorite. It's the one where Nancy Pelosi is ripping up the State of the Union address after Donald Trump gives it. Right? So lots of less collegiality happening inside Congress. It doesn't look at all like the story that William White tells us about the Senate. So he's writing this back in 1956, and he very much kind of praises the way the Senate operates. He says most men, and they're all men at that point, are alike in the deep sense that they are Senate men, joined in a common pride and meaning and tradition to their forum to outside attack from any source, not excluding the White House. They will certainly turn a common face, and they are, at the end, members of the Senate, even before they are members of the political party. Does that sound like the Senate that we all see on display these days? The book, The Citadel, has now been updated of sorts by Stephen Smith, who talks about the Senate syndrome, where he says that there's a procedural arms race taking place where partisan moves and counter moves play out over time. Adherence to tradition, constitutional design, and fairness are questioned. Advocates for bipartisanship, for more sensible legislators, for the defeat of all incumbents, and for procedural reform compete for attention. Right? And that was in 2014. Certainly, things haven't gotten better. There have been other books written about this. So Mickey Edwards, a former member himself, talks about the parties versus the people, how to turn Republicans and Democrats into Americans. And then Mike Lofgren writes a book called The Party is Over. And I particularly like the subtitle, How Republicans Went Crazy, Democrats Became Useless, and the Middle Class Got Shafted. I've contributed a bit to this literature, and David has already introduced the book, right, the Gingrich Senators, where I argued that the warfare that we knew took place in the House of Representatives, really, I argue it started in a big degree with Newt Gingrich, and then Republicans learned that style of politics, and then they moved to the Senate, and they introduced those same types of warfare measures over in the Senate. On one occasion, one of my students' mom worked at a bookshop, and that bookshop was hosting Newt Gingrich. And so she says, have you ever heard of this book called The Gingrich Senators? And Gingrich says, I have heard of that book. And she said, well, my son helped, right, the professor gather some data that he then turns into this book. And she said, what do you think of the book? And Newt Gingrich was reputed to have said, I think the author gave me too much credit. And so today, I think that I'm the only person in the world who Newt Gingrich thinks gave him too much credit. The guy likes getting credit. So what Newt does then at that point is he grabs one of his books and he says, I'm going to give this professor one of my books. And so this is my former student, Zach, when he presented me with a book. And then the inscription says, to Sean Theriault, hopefully this will lead to a solution-oriented Senate. Your fan, Newt. One of my most prized possessions. So those are the pathologies. Unlike Dan from last night, I'm going to try to give you some solutions to these pathologies. And I'm going to start off with Evan Bayh. When he announces that he's not going to run for the Senate again, he says, for some time I've had a growing conviction that Congress is not operating as it should. There is too much partisanship and not enough progress, too much narrow ideology, not enough practical problem solving. Even at a time of enormous national challenge, the people's business is not getting done. And so what he's suggesting there is all ideological. There are just people on the far right and there are people on the far left, and they just don't get along, and they just can't solve some of these problems. And I think about it a little bit differently. And part of the reason I do is because of the state that I live in, right? So I live in Texas, where we have a senior senator, John Cornyn, who has been part of the Republican leadership. People talk about him perhaps becoming the next Mitch McConnell. And you can imagine John Cornyn in a conversation with Susan Collins and Barack Obama trying to solve some kind of problem. Very conservative, but yet he knows that there are problems that need to be solved, and he's willing to talk to the other side to try and figure out some type of solution. The junior senator from the great state of Texas is Ted Cruz. Very conservative. He engages the legislative process, shall we say, in a different way. So you might remember him most famously from the fake filibuster that he has trying to defund Obamacare. So here he is at 3:27 in the afternoon. Here he is at 8 o'clock. Sometime between 8 o'clock and the next morning, remember he's reading Green Eggs and Ham to his daughters on the Senate floor to try and stop the funding. And here he is at noon the next day, right? So he engages the legislative process in a different way, right? It's not just the hunches or the feelings that I have about them, right? A cartoonist has the same type of feelings. Senator Cruz heads off to another day of mature, responsible legislating by packing a cannonball in his briefcase, right? It's not just cartoonists and academics that think this. It's even senators that think this, right? So Al Franken says, here's the thing you have to understand about Ted Cruz. I like Ted Cruz more than most of my other colleagues like Ted Cruz, and I hate Ted Cruz. It's not just Democrats, but it's also Republicans. So Lindsey Graham says, if you killed Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate and the trial was in the Senate, nobody would convict you. And we've seen a couple of times where Ted Cruz is looking for a second to a motion that he's put on the Senate floor, and he just looks around looking for that second, and no one will second his motion, right? So again, he engages the legislative process differently. But yet when they vote very similarly, right? So 93% of the time they vote in the same direction. And when they split, right, they split with Bernie Sanders about the same amount of time, right? So there's sometimes that John Cornyn is voting with Bernie Sanders against Ted Cruz, and sometimes it's vice versa. So I know that ideology isn't the whole answer to the problem. And so I think that there's another dimension we need to think about, and it's whether people are willing to engage each other, whether they're willing to have the things that Dan was talking about yesterday, dialogue, compromise. And in order to do that, you actually have to have relationships to do that. What we know about kind of compromise is that the longer the relationship, the more trust there's there, the more likely you are to try and solve some problems. It's hard to get at personal relationships, right? Like even imagine in our own lives. Now imagine observing it from the outside. I mean, I wish that I could get the visitor logs to Joe Manchin's boat that's docked in the Potomac. These are famous. Like he will just pack in like 8 senators. They'll go for a ride up and down the Potomac. They'll have some beers and some pizza, and they'll try and solve some problems, right? Unfortunately, the visitor logs to Almost Heaven aren't available to the public. I wish that I could get the phone calls that Chuck Schumer makes from his flip phone, right? Remember, he famously doesn't have a smartphone, and he knows all the senators' numbers. And so if I knew who he was calling, then I could get a little bit at who the people are that he engages with to try and solve some problems. And so, right, unfortunately, we don't have those data. But I think that there's something to the importance of these interpersonal relationships. Before I go on, though, I should alert you that not everyone thinks that personal relationships matter all that much. And so maybe I'll refer back to a favorite son of the state in which we are now, Illinois, to hear a little bit about what he thinks about the personal relationships.
Of course, even after I've done all this, some folks still don't think I spend enough time with Congress. Why don't you get a drink with Mitch McConnell, they ask. Really? Why don't you get a drink with Mitch McConnell?
So you might see this as the 2013 White House Correspondents' Dinner, right? And he's really skeptical of this idea of interpersonal relationships. So what happens a year and a few months after that are the 2014 elections, in which Democrats lose seats in all of those bright red states. They lose the majority. And so in the days after they lose the majority, someone asks Barack Obama about those things that he was saying about getting a drink with Mitch McConnell. And here's what he had to say then.
I would enjoy having some Kentucky bourbon with Mitch McConnell. I don't know what his preferred drink is, but...
So it turned out the drinking bourbon with Mitch McConnell didn't ever happen. And I don't think any of us are surprised by that. But we know that other presidents have had different relationships with Mitch McConnell, right? So we know that Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden have long-standing friendship. When Mitch has had those moments where he's froze in front of the cameras, like Joe Biden is one of the first people that calls and just makes sure that his old friend is doing all right. This photo was taken when the president went down to Kentucky, when Mitch McConnell was doing an event at the McConnell Center. And we know that these cross-party relationships have existed for a long time, right? One of my favorite ones that I discovered only in doing this research, it's not one that people normally talk about all that much, is between Thad Cochran and Pat Leahy. So Thad Cochran is on the left, which I guess is wrong because he should be on the right. He's a conservative senator from Mississippi. He was an appropriator, long-serving senator, very conservative. And then Pat Leahy from Vermont, Democrat, pretty liberal. You might know him from his cameos in the Batman movies. They had a long-standing cross-party relationship. In fact, when Thad Cochran announces that he's leaving the Senate because he's ill, Pat Leahy goes to the Senate floor and says, he's the best friend I ever had in the Senate. I know he'll keep his word to me. He knows I'll keep my word to him. Unfortunately, some in both parties are forgetting that. In retort, Thad Cochran says, we fought side by side with each other, sometimes face to face against each other, but always with friendship and respect. No matter the issue, we walk out of the Senate chamber with our arms around each other, right? Those beautiful kind of cross-party relationships that really, they tug at my heartstrings when I think about the institution of the Senate and how important it is, right? And it's just not Thad Cochran and Pat Leahy. Of course, we know that Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy had a long-running relationship, so much so that Ted Kennedy credits Orrin Hatch with making him sober. He adores him so much that when Ted Kennedy gets married to Vicky, Orrin Hatch is his best man at the wedding, right? Long-standing friendship, right? Also, John McCain and Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman previously had been the VP nominee for the Democratic Party, but 4 years later 8 years later, goes to the Republican convention and places in nomination his friend John McCain to be the Republican nominee. So we know that these interpersonal relationships have existed in the Senate. And right there's a picture of the Senate, and I'm trying to get at these interpersonal relationships, the social fabric of the Senate, how interpersonally these people get along. But at the end of the day, I'm a social scientist, right? And so what I need to do is I need to find data. I need to find observable data that's quantifiable, that's publicly available, to try and get at the interpersonal relationships. So what I've been on a quest the last, 6 years, 7 years, is trying to think of ways in which I can try and tease out interpersonal relationships. So what I'm going to introduce to you the rest of my talk is some of the ways that I think that we can probably try and get at these interpersonal relationships. And I'm going to start from the ones that are most legislatively oriented to the ones that are least legislatively oriented. So the first one are conference committees, right? If we think about the way that Congress is supposed to work, the House passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill, and then they stick people from both chambers in a room and they say, iron out the compromises so we can get something to the president's desk, right? It looks something like this, where you have Democrat House members facing Democratic Senate members, and then on the opposite side, the Republicans from the two chambers too, sitting at a four-sided table. They need a majority of both the House and the Senate in order for the conference committee report to be given back to both chambers to vote on. And what's happened is that there are fewer conference committees across time. So there are different ways of resolving bills. Sometimes they just don't choose to resolve the differences between bills. And so what this one is getting at is just the opportunity to form interpersonal relationships. When you're stuck in a room trying to iron out compromises, it gives you the opportunity to figure out who the person is next to you and try and solve some problems. The next data that we're gathering a lot of are CODELs. These are congressional trips abroad, right? So you might have heard of Mitch McConnell just being in China just a couple of days ago, and I think he's going to Japan and South Korea along with 4 other senators. And I haven't figured out who those 4 senators are. But sometimes when they do these trips abroad, they're bipartisan, right? So this is a bipartisan CODEL to Israel from a few years ago. Sometimes they travel in single party, right? So these are just a bunch of Republicans meeting with Zelensky in Ukraine from last year. And then some senators just travel alone. Another way that we can try and get at these, and I should say about CODELs, the difficult part is that senators don't often like you to know all of the details of their CODELs. In the House, you have to report who you're traveling with, the dates that you're traveling, how much money you spent. In the Senate, you just have to file quarterly reports, right? So I know that, as an example, Senator X went to Jordan sometime between January and March. And I know that Senator Y also went to Jordan sometime between January and March. And then we can make some probabilistic determination as to whether or not they're traveling together. And that's the best that we can do with the Senate data. And that's if we get some of these news reports like Chuck Schumer traveling with these people, right? Then it's not probabilistic, then we just know what the data are. Another piece of data is looking at leadership PAC data. And I'll use EJ as an example here. So imagine that I'm a Republican in the Senate, EJ is a Democrat in the Senate. If Aleka is running against EJ, challenging EJ's seat, even if Aleka is of my party, I'm not going to donate money to her because probability is that EJ is going to win, and I don't want to poison the well. And that used to be a norm in the Senate. You just didn't donate to other senator incumbents. You know, when there was an open seat, both parties would fight like heck to try and get that open seat. But you just wouldn't go after your colleagues because you need to work with them at the end of the day, right? It's a norm that lasted for a few years, but now we see that the amount of money that senators are donating to the challengers of other senators is going way up. There used to be, right, we see elements of this continuing, like some states have a Democratic and Republican senator and they'll do a non-compete clause where they vow that they won't campaign against the other one. Sometimes they work, right? Harry Reid and John Ensign had one of these in Nevada, and it worked for a few years. Tom Harkin and Chuck Grassley in Iowa had this. The female senators, for a long time, wouldn't do this, right? So even if you were a female Republican, you wouldn't donate to the Republican challenger or to a Democratic female senator. But some female senators are now doing that. Another piece of data we can look at are press events. So who is willing to stand at a podium with someone of the opposite party, and how willingly are they to do that, right? So sometimes, again, it's bipartisan, right? So here you have Ron Wyden and Pat Leahy and Rand Paul doing a common event, talking about some piece of legislation that they're going to introduce, and they hope the Senate takes this up as a way of solving some type of problem. Sometimes these press events are just single-party affairs, right? So here's Mitch McConnell with Republican leadership. What we know across time is that the bipartisan press events are going down. Those are the ones that are in black. And the single-party partisan press conferences are going up. Those are the white bars. And when we look at the changing behavior, we see it's really the Democrats that are driving this trend. So the Democrats are having many more single-party press events than they did before. As a consequence, there are far fewer bipartisan ones. Another piece of data, and this next piece is the only data that we have now fully collected, going all the way back to the 1970s, and it's tributes and farewells. So when a senator announces that they're running, or that they're retiring, they're not going to run for next term, or they lose in an election, they'll go to the Senate floor and they'll give their last speech. And inevitably, in this last speech, they're saying all the good things that happened. They're thanking their staffs, and they're thanking their families for enduring the hardships of being, having someone in the Senate. And frequently, they'll tell stories. Oh, remember when you and I went to Ukraine and we met with Zelensky, and then we had bourbon? I don't know what stories they tell. But they're naming other senators. And so when they name a senator, that tells me something about the interpersonal relationships. In your farewell address, you're unlikely to talk about events that were meaningless to you, but rather talking about who your friends are. And then after the farewell address, other senators will take to the Senate floor and they'll give tribute speeches. And they'll say, you were just a great senator, and I so appreciated working with you. And so we know who's showing up and giving those speeches. And these speeches are really important to the members. Frequently, their staffs will create a book of all of the tribute speeches. I had the pleasure of talking to Kay Hagan's husband. Kay Hagan is no longer with us, but I talked to her husband. Kay was a senator from North Carolina. And he said that book that her staff put together was her favorite kind of memento from her time in the Senate, was hearing all the other senators say nice things about her. Unfortunately, we haven't finished coding all the data, but we know if we went back to the 105th Congress, there were about 21.6 tributes that were given to retiring senators. So about a quarter of the chamber would give a speech. And then in the 115th Congress, 20 years later, there was only 14 colleagues that were willing to show up. And what we know is that decline is entirely driven by cross-party people showing up. So the number of same-party folks showing up went from 11.8 to 8.8, so roughly the same number. But the number of cross-party senators who are giving those tributes has been cut in half, from 9.8 to 4.7. Another thing that we can look at are swearing-in photos, right? So they all take the oath of office on the floors of their chambers, but then right after, unless if you have 15 votes to become speaker, that doesn't happen right after, it happens a few days later, is there will be a fake kind of swearing-in photo. So here you have Mitt Romney, right, with his wife holding the Mormon Bible and shaking hands with the presiding officer of the Senate, the vice president, right? And I think this is Joe Biden's favorite day, was when he was serving as vice president. He just loves, like, kind of mixing it up with the people. Although sometimes it gives us some pretty gross images of our current president, so I'll go through those very quickly. I got this idea of swearing-in photos because of my former student. So Lance Gooden, right, elected to Congress. And he was telling me that there are people that wouldn't show up for the swearing-in photo with Nancy Pelosi because they didn't want their photo to be with Nancy Pelosi, Republican members. Lance wasn't one of those people. And so he was on his first day in the Congress being sworn in, and so he had his photo taken. The people, Lance was an establishment Republican at this point. He's become a pretty Trumpian Republican now. But the Tea Party folks back in his district saw that photo. And so they put it up on the internet, and they said, it took Lance Gooden exactly 1 day to become a Pelosi Democrat. And so all the people are piling on about how horrible Lance is and how he's sold out. And then someone says, hey, wait a minute. There's another person in that photo, right? Whose hand is that? And so, right, a couple of hours later, the full photo comes into being, who that other person is. And the story here is that, right, you're given one picture with the speaker, right? And it's neat. She does this in a room like this, right? So there will be a group there and a group there, and there will be lines. And so this group is setting up. Nancy Pelosi will walk across the stage, pose for the photo there, and then that group will disassemble and a new group will form. She'll walk across the stage over here and she'll do that photo, and she does this 434 times unless the people don't show up. And when Lance's one photo was done with his family and his mom and his dad and aunts and uncles who flew into DC, he turned to the speaker and said, "Speaker Pelosi, my Congress professor came all the way up from Texas to be with me today. Would you just be in a photo with the two of us?" And Nancy grabs my hand and says, "Of course I will." And so Lance is the only person that got 2 photos that day. And I'm awfully grateful for that. It's fun. Someone asked, so who do you think was happiest on this day? Was it Nancy Pelosi becoming the speaker again? Was it Lance Gooden being elected to Congress, this guy from a rural town in Texas? Or was it the Congress professor? I think it was the Congress professor. Now we're getting into the silly. So social events. So Seersucker Thursday. So some Thursday in the middle of the summer in Washington, D.C., a bunch of senators will wear their seersucker suits. There they are. There's always an official photo. So I have my students kind of figure out who all these people are, and we record their names. And if you're willing to look like that for a day, it says something about how you're willing to engage the process. Bless Dianne Feinstein's heart. So there were no women that were participating, It was before this photo was taken. And so Dianne would always participate. And so finally she went to some of her best friends in the Senate and she said, "Why don't you wear your seersucker suits on Seersucker Thursday?" And they all looked at her and was like, "We don't own seersucker suits." And so Dianne hired a tailor to come and get the measurements for all the women so that they could then participate in Seersucker Thursday. That's the kind of institutionalist Dianne Feinstein was. Unfortunately, the people participating in Seersucker Thursday is going down. You can't even do that. And then perhaps my favorite is the Secret Santa. So they have this tradition now between Thanksgiving and Christmas that all the senators will put themselves in a room for an afternoon, and they'll just enjoy each other's company. And it's a fun story, Amid all of the horror stories that you hear coming out of Washington, it's nice to have some positive news. And so people usually write these things up. And so I have my students gather all the articles about that, and usually we can get about 80% of the people who are participating. Sometimes people are tweeting about it, sometimes there's press accounts, sometimes there's photos. And so we're pretty good on getting the participation rates of the Secret Santa. And then they exchange presents, So here's Thad Cochran and Joe Manchin and Al Franken, And here's Heidi Heitkamp and Rob Portman, and they're showing off the gifts that they got from each other. To kind of bring the talk almost full circle, when the people participate in this particular Secret Santa, there were 22 Republicans that showed up and 25 didn't. There were 40 Democrats that showed up and 13 Democrats who didn't. And when we look at the ideological scores of those who went and those who didn't go, there's almost no difference. So it's not like the 25 most conservative Republicans weren't showing up. I'm sure a lot of really conservative Republicans were showing up, but they're the people that are talking across the aisle trying to solve problems. They're still voting in a conservative way, but they're willing to engage in the dialogue of trying to solve problems. And the 13 Democrats that weren't showing up aren't the most liberal ones, They're spread across the entire continuum. So at this point in the project, what I think I've done so far I feel pretty good about this one. The social fabric isn't the same thing as ideology. You can be conservative and you can be a far-out liberal, and you can still engage with the other side. Ted Kennedy, the liberal lion, If you wanted to solve a problem, you talked to Ted Kennedy. He'd find common ground. They would write legislation and they would pass legislation. He knew how to get this done. In fact, Lindsey Graham was on the Sunday morning talk shows this past weekend talking about Dianne Feinstein. And he said that when he showed up in the Senate, he was given lots of advice. And he said, the best piece of advice I was ever given was, they said, if you want to solve a problem, talk to either Dianne Feinstein or Ted Kennedy. Because when you would get Dianne Feinstein or Ted Kennedy at a table, you would figure out common ground, you would write legislation, and because they had the reputations that they had in the Senate, they could bring along 7, 8, 10, 12 other Democrats. And because that's how their reputations were, and it's because they knew how to talk across the aisle. What I think I've started to do is measure the decline of the social fabric. And I feel pretty good about having good enough data to suggest that there is a decline in the interpersonal relationships across the aisle in the Senate. In the next phase of the project, the part of the project that I think is going to be hardest is to measure this decline effect on the institution. So it doesn't, in fact, mean, right, can I tie this back to the beginning, the pathologies? Is this the reason the Senate is less productive? Is this the reason that we have more filibusters? Is this the reason that we have had no promotions in the military for the last 7 months? And so that's where I am in the project. So at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Laurel. Yeah, that's interesting.
Some of them it seems like it's really about their colleagues maybe to the audience. Other times it may be media, and does that matter?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that we always need to think about who the audience is. One of the suggestions I've been given in this project is looking at tweets. And so, right, we've gathered all of the tweets that senators have sent, and we've coded them for all of the people that they mention in the tweet. And we've coded even if it's a positive, negative, or neutral mention, right? So you could imagine, right, EJ and I are hanging out and we just passed good legislation, positive, right? EJ is the dirtiest scumbag that serves in the Senate, negative. Or I saw EJ in the hallway, neutral. In there, I think the audience, right, like you're tweeting about that for a reason, right? Like, I'm not sure that that suggests like your deep-seated friends. And so I ran this idea past people, and I ran it past a John Cornyn staffer. And the John Cornyn staffer says the tweets he didn't think were a great measure because, right, John Cornyn's just bored, and so the last person he saw is the one that he's tweeting about, right? And so I think it's important to always remember the audience. And when I think back to the list, right, the Secret Santa, right, that's got to be the most, right, the least public facing, right, because unless if they're the ones that are then advertising it and then they're trying to maybe show that they're more of an institutionalist, which would be a really weird strategy for senators to invoke these days. But that's helpful for me, right? Thank you for making me think a little bit harder about the audience. But I hope that I'm gathering enough different measures in enough different contexts, and the correlation is going to be good enough across them that it all kind of says, sure, audience differs between these things, but in the end, there's still a thing that we can call the social fabric, and we can measure it in the ways that I'm trying to do it.
Thanks, Sean. I really like what you're doing here. It's empirically really interesting. I'll note that there's maybe a distinction between willingness to talk versus being friends, and you're going to kind of cover that spectrum
Yep.
as well. I'm going to follow Dr. Merriman's call for controversy with a bit of a normative focus. Who shouldn't senators or all of us be friends with? I'm thinking about Joe Biden, his comments about being friends with Eastman, the most virulent, violent white supremacists in the history of the Senate. Should we be friends with people like that, or people who seek to overturn democratic elections? If so, what are the moral and democratic costs?
Wow. I'm a social scientist. I look at zeros and ones. But I can't help but think of the place that we are, right, Springfield, Illinois, right, the land of Lincoln. And I think that John Inskeep, am I getting that name right, from NPR, who just wrote the book about Lincoln. Steve Inskeep, yep. Who he, right, and he purposefully picks people to which Lincoln had great disagreements with, and then talks about the relationship, what he was able to get out of the relationship, and how he helped the country be better because of the engagement. And, right, we're in Springfield, so I guess I'm just gonna, right, I'm gonna be Pollyannish about this. And be that, right, there's no doubt that John Eastman isn't someone that we should put on a pedestal these days, but I gotta believe that there is some good in him, and if another senator can find that good and help solve a problem, then I think you do that. They have the cover of not choosing, right, they're given to work with two different people from Mississippi, right? It's not like they've chosen him to represent Mississippi and then they're working with him. And so you have to play with the cards that you've been given, And I gotta believe that there's some good in everyone, and if you can find the common ground with that person and get them on that issue, and at the same time calling them out on the bad stuff, then that's just what you have to do. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for the question. There's a photo that I have that's not part of the presentation, and because of this comment, I'll include it in future presentations, of Kamala Harris, right? So the women senators have always had a strong network, and they've always had, and this is started by Barbara Mikulski primarily, right? So Barbara Mikulski was the big driver, long-serving senator, the longest-serving senator up until female senator up until Dianne Feinstein. And they would have dinner, let's say once a semester, once a quarter. And when Kamala Harris was elected vice president, she invited all of the female senators up to the vice presidential mansion for one of these dinners. And interestingly, there was one female senator that didn't show up. And we're talking, right, at that point there was probably 24, I think, female senators. Anyone have any idea who the one senator is? You know her. No, you don't know her that well then. Not as well as Tim. So it was Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona. And that rings true. Like, Kyrsten Sinema marches to a different drum, and she wasn't going to show up. So, but I think you're right. And I think that, right, you certainly saw it with Kamala Harris and Booker, right, a kind of relationship, although it didn't stop them from running against each other. But I think that sometimes there's that, right, that common bond, at least in those instances, right? I'm not sure if Bob Menendez and Ted Cruz are having beer. I was just thinking about what they would talk about over the course of the last couple of weeks, right? I mean, I'm not sure that it exists in all of the pairs, but thinking about the common, right? You can imagine a lot of these cross-party relationships, especially back in the 70s and 80s, were from World War II veterans, right? Like, common experiences allow you to form those bonds a little bit more easily. Thankfully, the Senate's becoming a little bit less white, a little bit less male, and so, right, we should, in a few years, have enough data to see if there's a difference among the non-old white men. Yeah.
Right? If you've got a dysfunctional unit, maybe that breaks down social fabric, and vice versa.
Yep. No, you're right. What I'll say is that you're right. Right. These social relationships matter in lots of different contexts. One of the reasons that I like this project is if we think about it in a business context, right? There's a hiring person, right? And there's a hierarchy such that you can isolate dysfunctional people. Right? In the Senate, right, referring back to the earlier question about Johnny, you don't have that ability, right? Like, sure, you can kick out Johnny, but you're not going to do that. And so I like that these senators have to work with each other, and that there's no hierarchy that can try and deal with the bad employees in this particular sense. But to the main part of your question, like cause and effect, it's really hard. Close your ears, Laurel. Right, there's a big movement going in, and there are other people, Brian and EJ, right? There's a big movement in political science these days about causal inference. And, right, like, I study Congress. It's an endogenous institution. I'm just doing the best that I can. And so, right, I'm just going to shrug my shoulders and apologize, because it is. Let's go there. And I'll form a queue, so 1, 2, 3. And I don't know how much more time. I don't know where we are. Okay. Yeah, there really is. And we see that, I mean, we have these, right, these vestiges of bipartisanship that still exist, right? I learned about Congress in the classroom as an undergraduate, but I worked in Congress for a year and a half. And I worked for an office called the Legislative Council. So they're then there were like 34, now there are about 40 attorneys that turn the ideas into legal language that become bills that become laws. And when there is a party switch in the majority, all of those lawyers keep their jobs, right? They work for Democrats, they work for Republicans, they'll work for Democrat committee staff in the morning, they'll work with Republican committee staff in the afternoon, they maintain attorney-client privileges. The parliamentarian, the person that keeps order on the floor of the House, has the same sort of nonpartisan job. Works for Democrats, works for Republicans, there have been switches in parties, and the parliamentarian's office is unaffected. There are those vestiges of bipartisanship. And I feel, right, like one of those is that the former speakers get to keep their offices in the Capitol, right? And then Nancy Pelosi was kicked out of hers. And so, right, another thread that was of bipartisanship is gone. One of those threads that persists is the relationship and the community of staffers. I think that people find who they can trust on the other side. I think it happens for the people in front of the cameras, and it happens for those behind the curtains. And so you'll hear all the time about baby showers and weddings where there's Democrats and Republicans at them. There's a political scientist at Virginia and Vanderbilt, legislative effectiveness scores. They're getting these legislative effectiveness scores. And the project has evolved so much that they're now looking at staffers to see if they can pin this a little bit on their staffs. And so I could imagine, right, like, if I live long enough, right, like getting down to the staff level for some of this stuff. I'm sure some of this is driven just by people liking each other, but I'm sure it's also driven by, look, I have a guy in that office that we can trust. And if this is what they're doing, right, a former student, and I think I can divulge this, is legislative director for John Cornyn. And so he'll send me email threads on occasion, right, of them negotiating the language on a bill for solving some problem. And it's just unbelievable the amount of trust that they have, right? Because in that email thread, they're saying things that if it ever went public, right, it would be embarrassing to Senate staff and stuff. But there is trust there. And it makes me feel good about the institution that still exists because, right, like I'm not sure that Ted Cornyn's staff, Ted Cruz's staff is having many of those email exchanges in the same way that Cornyn's staff is, right? So getting back to your question, right? Is that because people like John Cornyn, or is it because he has this reputation? Right? Like, I don't know. But those conversations are happening with Cornyn. I can't imagine they're happening with Cruz. So staffs definitely matter.
It is a much more diverse legislature, Congress, state than 75 when I came here to work for on the legislative staff for the General Assembly. So it's about the people that are there, but in addition to more women, people of different religions, marginalized groups coming in and being members of the body, you've also, their issues come into the body. That's a much more complex, contentious agenda. The legislature in 1975 never argued or worried about issues that were relevant to, gay people, to, if we took up things that were gender related, like no fault divorce, it was just amazing. The only reason that why it was really important to keep fault in divorce was we had all of these women that were trying to steal the property and the resources of the men that they were married to that dominated the discussion in the House. And so it's a much more complex and contentious environment to be collegial and to find compromise, particularly when the issues get to they're kind of existential in terms of a person's identity.
No, absolutely. Point taken. Appreciate that, right? I mean, we can't be surprised that breast cancer research was so far behind prostate cancer research when the decision makers and the people allocating money were men, right? No doubt about it. And then there was a question down here. Yeah. No. Yeah, I've thought about that a bit. In fact, I'll answer your question with an anecdote. So Pat Toomey, senator from Pennsylvania, former senator now, he came into the Senate as one of these rabble-rousers. He left the Senate as one of the institutionalists, right? We might remember most famously from on his way out the door trying to solve some of the gun stuff with Joe Manchin, right? The Toomey Manchin amendment to the gun bill. And right, he was asked about Secret Santa, and he said, "Why didn't you go to the Secret Santa?" And he's like, "You want to know what? I'll go to the Secret Santa when Harry Reid puts a budget on the Senate floor. Then I'll want to talk to senators. But until Harry Reid does that, I'm not doing anything like that." And so I think you're right there. I think there are some people who aren't doing that. I think those are also the same people who aren't trying. At that point in his career, I don't think he was trying to solve problems. So I think that true. And I think that's right. That makes me feel a little bit better about the data, in fact. Let's go there and then there.
So when you look at the declining social fabric of the Senate, have you seen how that parallels society as a whole?
Yeah.
How it parallels the development of social media?
Yeah. Right. So I haven't. This project is hard enough just focusing on the Senate. Social media, wow. But right, I can't talk about this without having that kind of in the back, right? Social media, campaign finance, right? Old traditional media, right? All those things are kind of like in that orbit. But until I get my hands around the throat of this, that's just informing how I think about it, and I'm not yet kind of doing any of that hard work. Right? Yeah.
I know that the answer to this question is no, but I was thinking about, the gym and
Mm-hmm.
lunchroom. Like, who do they eat with and who do they, exercise with? Because there was recently a story about who was on the bike in the Senate. And exactly what they looked like also because it looked like they were there for political reasons rather than exercise. I was wondering, is there any way to leverage that and send spies to the lunchroom, have a student there counting,
No, right.
figuring out who it.
So, right, I'm really good at anecdata. I'm going to answer your question with a couple of anecdotes that I know. The first one is the two biggest gym gladflies in the Congress are Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy. They love spending time in the gym. And to look at them, okay, maybe they're doing a little bit of weight, but I think they're schmoozing, right? And both of them are known for being big schmoozers. And, right, you're a lot less guarded when you're wearing shorts and a tank top than you are when you're wearing a suit. And so I think that they can engage in those kinds of conversations at the gym. On this last time I was in D.C. with my students, we were walking through the halls with Congressman Gooden, and we were down in the tunnels, and he said, "Hey, do you trust your students for just 10 minutes?" And I was like, "Sure." He's like, "I want to show you something." And so he said, "Just tell them to just wait right here, and we'll be back in 10 minutes." And I was like, "All right, y'all just wait right here. We're going to be back in 10 minutes." He took me through doors, not unlike the doors here, and I was in the house gym. And I was like, "Lance, I am staying here for the next 2 years to record every single person." And so then he takes me down to the right where the lockers are, and all of their names are on their lockers. I was like, "Can I just take photos?" He's like, "No, you can't do that." I wish that I could. And I could smell the lockers to figure out how frequently they come to the gym. No smell, they're never there, stinky, there all the time. And then the lunchroom, right? This is a true story. There used to be a senator's only dining room in the Senate restaurant. They shut the room because no senators were using it. So, yep. Yep.
Just a question looking down the road a little bit. And again, it sounds like your hands have been full and continue to be full with this project, right? But I guess what I'm wondering about is do you think replicating this for state houses is something to be thought about, or maybe engaging sort of a consortium or group of colleagues to do that at maybe selected state houses? Is that just an impossible sort of project, and more importantly, would there be some value to that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea, right? And I gotta believe for however important it is for Congress, it's so much more important for state legislatures because, right, in Illinois, you're never more than, 3.5 hours from your home? And so your ability to stay in Springfield one more night is so much easier than if you're in Washington where you're trying to catch the last plane out to be home before, right, so you can sleep in your own bed. And so the opportunities for that interpersonal relationship building, I gotta believe, are so much stronger in state legislatures than they are in Congress. So I would feel that, right, in thinking in the American context, I'm taking a hard case. And so if I can find evidence in a hard case, then I'd love to replicate it. And I wonder if there are easy ways of replicating this, because we can imagine, right, states have very different political cultures, right? There are some states that, in Texas, in the House these days, right, the Speaker of the Texas House still has his position because of Democratic votes. So I gotta believe that means something then the Texas Senate, where, right, it's led with an iron fist by Dan Patrick, who has no Democratic support. And so thinking about those sorts of things and how they would differ across states and across institutions is really where you could get some really interesting theoretical leverage on the project. EJ.
The Senate's had a good couple of years, or a good period before this year, I guess, maybe even this year. They're passing bills, bipartisan bills. They've already come to agreements on budgets that the House wanted to consider. Last Congress, you had major infrastructure bills, CHIPS bills. Congress before that, the Senate passed this huge, really important COVID policy. A lot of senators voted to impeach Donald Trump both times, especially the second time through. Is it all that bad? I mean, should we really be studying the House and, members of the House kind of, arrest and kill each other not that long ago? It seems like the Senate's doing pretty good.
No, I think that you're right. And I think, like, if we all were feeling a little bit negative about Congressman Lipinski's talk yesterday, this is what I was thinking, right? He was talking about all these great bipartisan compromises. I was like, the CHIPS bill wasn't that long ago, right? The major infrastructure bill wasn't that long ago. So should I be studying the House? And no, you shouldn't. And quite right, the reason that I think that the Senate is so much more important is because at the end of the day, the House is, as according to the rules, it's a majoritarian institution. You only need majority party support to do whatever you want to do in the House. And but for a few exceptions in the Senate, you always need cross-party buy-in. And so the cross-party buy-in requires the interpersonal relationships, where in the House it just doesn't, because the majority party can do what it wants, unless if Matt Gaetz has 5 followers. The other thing that I would say is I think that you're right. The Senate has had a good run, and I think, right, like part of that has to be Joe Biden, right? Like, it just has to be. Like
Donald Trump had a good last 2 years in the Senate. He passed 2 massive COVID bills.
It's amazing what a pandemic can do. What I would say is that I think the Senate has, and I think part of the reason that it has is because of the longer terms of senators and the longer tenure of senators, right? So there are many more senators that were there in the 90s, one fewer than before. But the number of people that aren't willing to talk across the aisle, let's say it's only 20 people right now. All right, so now you have to get 60 out of those 80 people that are willing to do that. And in 5 years, it could be 75. So then you need 60 out of the 75. And at some point, right, you're going to be at the point where the House is, I'm afraid. So I think that now is kind of the critical time to be doing it. But point well taken.
That has to be the last question.
All right.
Good game.
Great.